Night is not scary because it is dark. Night is scary because when every sound fades, when the outside world is no longer there to distract us, we are forced to face a truth we spend daylight trying to avoid. We are far more fragile than we think. Some nights you lie still in the darkness, your eyes closed but your mind wide awake. A nameless question keeps looping in your head, never fully forming into words but heavy enough to weigh on your chest. What if this is my last night? Not everyone dares to say that question out loud, but almost everyone has felt it. People do not truly fear death. What makes them tremble is what comes after. The silence of the grave. The moment you are lowered into the earth when everything familiar disappears. No voices, no light, no one answering back. In that moment, everything you once clung to, status, money, fame, control, becomes meaningless. And at that fragile edge, the human heart wants only one thing: to be protected. There is a chapter in the Quran that was not revealed to decorate language or fuel academic debate. It was given to people like a shield in the night. A chapter that Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, described with a very specific name: the protector. Because it stands between the believer and the punishment of the grave. That chapter is Surah Al Mulk. But what makes this surah frightening in a completely different way is that it does not only speak about the next life, it goes straight for the deepest insecurity people carry even while they are still alive. It asks questions we do not like to hear. It strips away the layers of illusion we use to comfort ourselves every day. And it does not do it by shouting, not by theatrics, but with a calm voice so steady it forces the listener into silence. To understand why Surah Al Mulk carries such weight, we have to return to the moment it was revealed. This was not a time when Muslims were winning. It was a time of weakness, being hunted, isolated, and cut off from survival. Every day was a test. And in the long nights of that persecution, some hearts began to tremble, not because they doubted Allah, but because reality was brutal. The oppressors looked stronger by the day. The believers looked fewer by the day. And a quiet question began to surface inside them, the same question so many people carry today. If Allah is all-powerful, then why does evil seem to be winning? The answer did not arrive as soft comfort. It came as a declaration that shattered every human measure of power. Blessed is the one in whose hand is absolute dominion. That opening line flips the entire worldview upside down, because Surah Al Mulk is not trying to prove that Allah is stronger than the kings of the earth. It says something deeper, colder, and far more unsettling. The power you can see has never been real power. What people call strength exists for a brief moment in the timeline of history. Real power is what governs life and death, time and destiny without needing anyone's approval. For those hearing these words for the first time, it hit like a blow to the mind. Because if real dominion does not belong to the one holding the sword or the one holding the money, then the greatest fear inside the human heart begins to change shape. Instead of fearing the loss of what they have, they begin to fear something else. Living while forgetting who truly holds everything. And from that rightful fear, Surah Al Mulk becomes a companion in the night. Not to soothe the conscience, but to wake it up. Not to promise that tomorrow will be easier, but to remind you that a deeper, more permanent reality surrounds every storm in this life. Welcome to Prophetic History Explained. If what you are hearing right now is slowing your heartbeat, if it feels like something deep inside you has just been touched, then stay with us until the end of this video. And before we continue, subscribe to Prophetic History Explained to support the channel so we can keep bringing you stories with depth, perspectives you do not usually hear, and spiritual journeys that can change how you see the world and how you see yourself. Surah Al Mulk was not revealed in a peaceful era, and it did not arrive when Muslims were in a position of victory. It came at a time when every visible measure of power stood against the believers. Mecca was firmly controlled by the Quraysh leaders, people who held wealth, force, social networks, and the ability to decide the fate of the weak. They did not only possess political authority, they controlled collective belief, ancestral tradition, and the entire social order. To the Muslims of that time, every sign seemed to say the strong were right and the believers were losing. In that atmosphere, a quiet struggle emerged inside many hearts. Not a rejection of faith, but a very human confusion. They watched oppressors live comfortably, rich and respected, while they endured humiliation, hunger, and daily threats. The question was rarely spoken, but it echoed in the deepest place inside them. If Allah is all-powerful, why does power seem to sit with the unjust? The Quran's response was not meant to soothe temporary emotions. It did not deny the painful reality the Muslims were living, and it did not promise that society would instantly change. Instead, Surah Al Mulk does something more basic, deeper, and harder to accept. It completely redefines what power is. From the opening line, this chapter does not mention people, persecution, or enemies. It pulls the listener straight into a truth that rises above every historical moment. Blessing belongs to the one in whose hand is dominion. The word mulk does not mean power in the way humans usually mean it. It means absolute sovereignty, ownership, and control over reality itself. No one gave it to Allah, and no one can take it away. It existed before every empire, and it will remain after every worldly power collapses. That created a shock for the first listeners. Because if mulk belongs to Allah, then what they were seeing was only the surface of power, not its essence. An oppressor can control a city, a region, even an era, but they do not control life, death, time, or the final outcome. They can cause suffering, but they cannot decide what that suffering ultimately means. Surah Al Mulk does not deny that evil can look strong. It simply states something cold and undeniable. Strength is not the same as sovereignty. People confuse short-term influence with ultimate control. This chapter separates the two and forces the listener to accept that the power they fear is only a tiny fragment of a far larger picture. For persecuted Muslims, this did not erase the pain, but it changed how they carried the pain. When worldly power is no longer treated as the final measurement, injustice no longer becomes proof that Allah is absent. Instead, it becomes part of the test, a place where a person's true worth is revealed. Who remains steady without advantage? Who holds faith without signs of victory? Surah Al Mulk also quietly raises another question, deeper and aimed at every generation after them. If real power is not in human hands, why do people spend their entire lives chasing it at any cost? Why do status, wealth, and control over others become the definition of success, when all of it can vanish in a single moment? This chapter does not condemn ambition, but it exposes how fragile the things people call permanent really are. It reminds you that every power not connected to Allah has an expiration date, and every strength not placed under His mulk carries the seeds of collapse inside it. That warning was not only for the oppressors of Mecca, but for every society and every age where people keep worshiping new forms of power with the same old blindness. For the listener today, the message still lands with the same weight. We live in a world where power is measured by money, media influence, and the ability to control others. But Surah Al Mulk whispers an uncomfortable truth. Those things can intimidate people, but they do not decide anyone's final destiny. Real power runs quietly. It does not need to show off, and it never slips. By placing Allah's mulk first, this chapter does not only comfort the oppressed, It warns those who hold authority. It reminds them there is no position high enough to escape the watch of the Most High, and no power large enough to be exempt from final judgment. In that light, all worldly power becomes small, temporary, and fragile, far more than people like to admit. After resetting the meaning of power, Surah Al Mulk pulls the listener even deeper into a question no one can avoid. Why are we born? And why must we die? It does not leave that question floating in abstract philosophy. It places it at the center of existence. Life and death are not accidents of the universe, and they are not random games of fate. They were created on purpose, as a test. A test not measured by lifespan, status, or achievements, but by the quality of a person's actions and the wakefulness of the soul. That perspective shakes the most common human instinct. Most of us are taught that living means collecting, extending, and protecting at all costs. Death is treated as the enemy, a terrifying interruption we should avoid or forget. Surah Al Mulk flips that logic. It does not glorify life just because it is life, and it does not paint death as a meaningless disaster. Both are tools within a greater order where every moment of existence carries the weight of a test. From there, the chapter turns the human gaze upward to the sky. Not to escape reality, but to understand reality. It invites you to look and then look again, as if to say, if you doubt this order, examine it closely. Try to find a crack. Try to find a flaw. This invitation is not mere symbolism, it is an intellectual challenge. It assumes truth does not fear scrutiny, and that creation is stable enough to withstand the harshest stare of human reason. Here, Surah Al Mulk breaks another misconception, that faith and reason stand against each other. This chapter shows a faith so confident it invites repeated observation. Look, then look again, then look once more. You will not find distortion, not because people are not intelligent, but because this order was designed beyond manipulation and whim. When a person begins to see the universe that way, something important happens inside them. The world no longer feels like chaos where everything can collapse without meaning. It becomes a system with structure, layers, and guardianship. The heavens are not only physical space, but a sign of stability, of an order that is not shaken by human emotion or human power. Surah Al Mulk also opens a door into the unseen world, where what people cannot see is still operating without pause. It speaks of forces that guard this order, of boundaries that cannot be crossed. The message is not meant to satisfy curiosity, but to reposition the human being in the universe. We are not the absolute center, and we are not abandoned. We are part of a greater order where every action carries weight and every choice echoes farther than we imagine. For the first Muslims, this perspective changed everything. It made them realize their suffering was not a sign of being forsaken. If the vast universe runs with perfect order, then their difficult lives could not be a mistake. Pain was no longer evidence that Allah was absent, but evidence that the test was real. And once life is understood as a test, death changes meaning too. It is no longer the collapse of everything, but a transition point where the results begin to appear. This does not erase fear, but it turns fear into awareness. Instead of panicking before the unknown, the listener is invited to live with more intention in every remaining moment. Surah Al Mulk does not demand that people understand the entire universe, and it does not require them to explain every mystery. It asks for one thing: take existence seriously. Do not live as if everything is random. Do not die as if nothing waits beyond. Between life and death, between the wide sky and the small human heart, an order is quietly operating. And recognizing that order is the first step out of confusion and into meaning. When Surah Al Mulk speaks about the afterlife, its tone shifts in a subtle but decisive way. It no longer asks you to look up at the skies or reflect on cosmic order. Instead, it forces you to look back at yourself, at an ending no one can avoid. These are not images to satisfy curiosity about the unseen. They are mirrors held directly in front of the conscience while a person is still alive. The descriptions of hell in Surah Al Mulk do not begin with fire. They begin with the terror of realization. When those who denied the truth are thrown into it, the first thing they face is not physical pain, but a cold question from the keepers. Did no warner come to you? That question does not even need an answer because their silence is already a confession. They knew. They were reminded. They chose to ignore it. Surah Al Mulk shows that the greatest punishment is not the flame itself, but regret that arrives too late. It is the moment every excuse collapses, no blaming society, no blaming circumstances, no blaming other people, no second chances. Only raw shame as a person is forced to face their own choices. The truth they once treated lightly becomes so clear it cannot be denied, and that clarity becomes its own torment. What makes these descriptions so powerful is that Surah Al Mulk does not present hell as impulsive rage. It does not paint blind anger. Everything unfolds with a cold, perfect justice, unbiased and precise. Those who fall into it do not fall because they lacked information, but because they actively turned away from truth. In that light, punishment is not vengeance. It is the inevitable outcome of a path a person kept choosing. But Surah Al Mulk does not stop at warning. If fear is all you have, a person either becomes numb or collapses into despair. So alongside severe cautions, the chapter opens an opposite door filled with hope. It speaks about those who fear Allah even though they have never seen Him. This is not faith built on visible miracles, and it is not faith driven by immediate fear of punishment. It is faith nurtured in silence, in small choices when no one is watching and there is no reward in sight. Surah Al Mulk elevates that kind of faith. It shows that believing in what you cannot see requires deep inner maturity. When there is no visible proof, you must lean on honesty with yourself. People like that do not need surveillance to do what is right, and they do not need crowds to validate their belief. Their reward is not only forgiveness later, but a profound inner peace even in the present life. The contrast between the two groups in Surah Al Mulk is not meant to create cheap moral labels. It does not divide the world into people who are completely evil and people who are perfectly good. It reveals two inner tendencies. One tendency avoids truth when truth becomes inconvenient. The other accepts truth even when it demands sacrifice. In that sense, the afterlife is not a surprise. It is the logical continuation of the inner life a person has been building all along. That is why Surah Al Mulk remains painfully relevant today. We live in an age where truth is often blurred by noise, by rationalization, and by the pressure to live according to the crowd. Turning away from truth rarely happens in dramatic scenes. It happens through small compromises repeated every day. Surah Al Mulk reminds you that those quiet compromises shape a person's ending more than they realize. When the chapter speaks of hell and reward, it is not trying to trap the listener in constant fear. It is trying to awaken another kind of awareness, moral awareness. Every choice carries weight. Every time you silence the conscience leaves a mark, and every time you fear Allah in private, you are laying down a foundation that will hold you, even if no one sees it yet. In that light, the afterlife stops being distant. It becomes a mirror reflecting the present, forcing the question: if every shield was removed, if there were no more chances to fix anything, where would I stand? Surah Al Mulk does not answer for anyone. It places the question in front of the listener and then lets the silence after it do the rest. In its final verses, Surah Al Mulk brings the listener back to everyday life. where anxieties do not look like philosophy or cosmic questions but take very specific forms: food, income, safety. After speaking of absolute dominion, of life and death, of the afterlife and moral responsibility, it does not leave you floating in lofty ideas. It pulls you back down to the ground, to the harsh reality every person faces. At the time Surah Al Mulk was revealed, these worries were not theoretical at all. Muslims were surrounded, economically boycotted, cut off from trade, pushed toward hunger. Many families had to choose between abandoning faith or losing their livelihood. The Quran does not dismiss that fear. It asks a direct question, almost blunt. If Allah were to withhold provision, who could provide for you? The point is not to challenge intelligence, but to strike at the deepest weakness in the human heart. The illusion that security rests in systems we can see. Then the Quran uses an image desert people understand better than anyone: water. If your water were to sink deep into the ground, who could bring it back? This is not abstract symbolism. In the desert, water is the line between life and death. Through that image, Surah Al Mulk reminds you that, like water, everything you depend on sits beyond your absolute control. Not to spread panic, but to break a false belief that you can guarantee your own safety. When that message settles, Surah Al Mulk does not leave the listener in despair. It quietly opens a way out: reliance. Not reliance born from helplessness, but reliance rooted in the realization that there is a Lord controlling what you cannot. From here, the chapter connects to a specific practice from the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. Reciting Surah Al Mulk before sleep. In Islamic tradition, sleep is not only physical rest, it is treated like a small death, where the soul temporarily leaves the human being's active control. Every night is a moment of vulnerability. No one knows if they will wake up in the morning. In that fragile moment, reciting Surah Al Mulk is not just reading words. It is an act of handing things over. Handing over anxiety, handing over uncertainty, handing over your life to the one who holds absolute dominion. The 30 verses of Surah Al Mulk are arranged like a complete journey for the soul. Before it sinks into sleep, it begins by reminding you who holds power, takes you through the order of the universe, makes you face death and the afterlife, then ends with everyday questions about provision and protection. When you finish it, you are no longer trapped in a spiral of worry. You are placed into a calm, awake state. You do not control everything, but you are not abandoned. That is why, for centuries, Surah Al Mulk has become the friend of long nights. It is recited in poor homes surrounded by injustice, in minority communities living among unfamiliar societies, and in hearts wrestling with modern anxiety that has no clear name. In every setting, the core message stays the same. True security does not come from what you stockpile. It comes from knowing who you are relying on. For the listener today, living in a world that looks comfortable but feels unstable, Surah Al Mulk carries a unique kind of healing. It does not deny financial pressure, fear of the future, or the feeling of being on the edge. But it places those fears inside a wider frame, where they no longer swallow the meaning of life. When you understand that risk is not only money, but the sustaining care Allah gives both body and soul, your breathing begins to slow. The ending of Surah Al Mulk is not a flashy promise. It is an invitation to live differently. Live with the awareness that every day you wake up is a gift. Live with the preparation that every night you go to sleep could be your last. And live with the belief that a chapter of the Quran carried sincerely can protect you at the most fragile thresholds of existence. Those 30 verses are short enough to memorize, yet deep enough to stay with a person for a lifetime. Recited consistently in the night, Surah Al Mulk does not only protect the believer from the punishment of the grave, it teaches a rare art of living, trusting without giving up, fearing without despairing, and finding calm in a world that never stops shifting. The deepest lesson Surah Al Mulk leaves behind can be held in one truth. Live with the awareness of someone who does not own everything, but is cared for by the one who owns all things. When you understand that, the fear of the future stops choking you, and the obsession with controlling outcomes begins to loosen. You start living with more responsibility in your actions, more honesty with your conscience, and more humility toward what is beyond your reach. Applying that today does not require dramatic change. It starts with small habits, ending each day with reliance instead of worry, viewing trials as part of the test rather than proof of abandonment, and reminding yourself that risk, security, and the future are not decided by personal effort alone, but also by the will of Allah. Reciting Surah Al Mulk before sleep is not a robotic ritual. It is a way of resetting the soul's inner order once a day. If you feel the depth of these meanings, if you find yourself searching for perspectives that help you understand prophetic stories, spiritual history, and the layers hidden inside revelation, then join the Prophetic History Explained community so we can explore more beneficial knowledge together about the Quran, the prophets, the history of faith, and lessons you can apply directly to modern life. And do not forget to subscribe to support us so we can keep bringing deeper, honest, and meaningful content in the videos ahead.